screw this. I'm just gonna go back to like, what's the first principle, right? Like, what does the thing look at? Like, how accurate is it? What is it telling me? Spend all your time trying to understand it and test it and do predictions of performance, which historically has been pretty shitty. Or you can just say, screw it. I'm just going to pick a couple things I'm going to look at each day, heart rate variability, sleep, whatever. And then I'm just going to go train whatever the highest quality capacity I could get at that point. Maybe in the case of a high level athlete where they have really maxed out how much exercise they can do, maybe respiratory training on top of that may be useful because I can train something without the underlying physiologic stress. Choosing to do the hard thing, like choosing to do high intensity exercise, or for people who love high intensity exercise, doing more low to moderate intensity exercise. All those things, I think those are skill sets you can then build up and transfer to other aspects of your life too.
Hey, Mike, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. For the three listeners who don't know who you are, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I right now do primarily online training for a bunch of different clients. I have two certifications I created, Flex Diet Cert and the Physiologic Flexibility Cert. I did a PhD in exercise physiology, a master's in mechanical engineering, biomechanics. My undergrad was a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science. And then I'm an associate professor at the Carrick Institute. And yeah, other random stuff like lifting odd objects and kiteboarding.
Love it. To give a little bit of context to the conversation, I had a talk with Evan Picon. And
oh, nice.
Yeah,
Evan's the man.
He is the man. And I asked him, who do you want to hear about all things Moxy and physiological testing? And he came up with your name, where you mentioned your name.
Oh, that's very nice of him. I'll have to send him an early Christmas card.
I'm sure he'll appreciate that. So to get things kicked off, I want to talk about the Moxy. When did you first encounter the Moxy Monitor?
Yeah, so I first encountered it when Roger was presenting the early version at the Design a Medical Device Conference, which was here at the University of Minnesota. At the time, I was actually working part-time for a medical device company in cardiovascular products. And so I went to it, and he happened to be there, and I was like, well, this looks interesting. So I kind of talked to him about it, and I was like, wow, that's a pretty cool idea. And just kind of kept following it for a while, and I've told him this too, so it's not like a secret. So it wasn't like early on that I didn't trust the device. It was more the interfaces were just so kludgy, and so I was like, God, I don't know if I want to spend the money to do it or not. So I was one of these people who just kept waiting and waiting because I saw how everything was progressing. And so a couple of years ago, I ended up buying like the system and just been kind of playing around with it since.
What do you think of it initially in terms of its application, besides let's say the logistics of getting the data itself? What did you think of it initially?
Well, what I always wanted, and which they have now, is devices that can look local and also systemic, right? So I think Moxy is like really good for a local look. Right. So something you can slap on a muscle, you can get some basic information from that particular muscle. I think that's super cool. That's awesome. The downside is because it's local, you're only getting local data, right? Which has its pros and has its cons. That's just the nature of the beast. So if you have a couple more devices, if you have three, right, you can put one on like what's common, one on the right quad, one on the left quad, maybe one on a shoulder if they're doing a row or something like that. Kind of a more non-working muscle view too. And now what they have, I know you had Daniel on here too, with the PNOE device, you can get a metabolic cart at the systemic level. So a lot of my research was using, like hundreds of different metabolic carts for testing. And so I was more used to the systemic view. And, when I bought the PNOE device, I talked to them early on about integration with Moxy, and they said, yeah, it's on the list. We're going to do it. And so I think being able to get all of those things at once is kind of the future. And I think the interfaces are definitely getting a lot better. I know Moxy has an app they're doing a Kickstarter for now and stuff. And, Moxy was able early on to integrate into the Garmin, like the Garmin Phoenix, which I think it's probably an underutilized thing for training with it, not just testing. But to answer your question, I think being able to see local data and then being able to pair that with systemic data, and if you can get it synced where it's all in the same time course, to me, that's like super useful, right? Because now I can get heart rate, I can get some local data, and I can get systemic data. And that kind of gets you around some of the potential issues people could get themselves into if they don't look at the whole picture, right? So people send data, it's like, okay, that's cool. But like, what was the guy's output if you're doing it on a rower? Like the rower tells you watts, it tells you you like output, because at the end of the day, the athlete cares about the output. So even if you don't have any fancy testing and your output is getting better and better and your heart rate's staying around the same, you know you've made a physiologic improvement, and it's probably an efficiency improvement. So again, I think just being able to look at the whole picture of everything is super useful. And as that gets easier and easier to do, I think it'll be more accessible to more people too.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And one thing that I found using it about 6 months ago is that as I've used it more, I understand a lot more of it. Now I try to actually use it every single day, whether it's with me or with clients or athletes, because I find that you just need a lot of practice. So for yourself, what have you learned since you started using the device, and what have you changed in your process with your learned experience?
Yeah, I mean, probably and it sounds simple, but the biggest thing I learned was, so when we had the coronavirus and the lockdown started last March, I've converted my garage into a gym and testing center like 12 years ago. So it was great. I'm like, oh, well, maybe this is a perfect time to do more aerobic block, do a little bit more testing, set up my bike from high school, which is like a 25-year-old bike with road tires on it. Just put a little trainer on it and stuck a cheap sensor for speed on it. And I wanted to get power, but I didn't want to drop that much money. The sensors would have cost more than the damn bike, so I didn't do it. But I'm like, I got speed, I got some, distance. I got the basic parameters. And I've got a Concept 2 rower, a bunch of other equipment. So I'm like, I don't know, I'm just gonna, because for quite a while, for probably like 1 or 2 years, I just stopped following everyone online with what they were doing. And it wasn't that they were doing anything bad or even incorrect. I couldn't figure out heads or tails. And because everyone had kind of done it so much, they had kind of developed their own protocols and stuff, which is great. So I'm just like, screw this. I'm just gonna go back to like, what's the first principle, right? Like, what is the thing to look at? Like, how accurate is it? What is it telling me? So the biggest thing I figured out was when I started doing aerobic stuff, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do your classic, zone 2, zone 3-ish, long, slow aerobic distance stuff in the morning. So did that fasted, did some cold water immersion afterwards. And it went pretty good for like 3 weeks. And I started doing my normal training on top of it. And then started around week 2.5 even, my legs were just freaking sore like every day. And I'm like, I'm probably just not used to the work, whatever. And then I'm like, I got like how many thousands of dollars worth of equipment, like maybe I should test some shit, And so I just threw the Moxy on there. And what I realized was that even at about the same heart rate, again, for my physiology, on the Moxy, when I put it on the quad, like I was hitting a DSAT of in the 20s within probably a minute on the rower. I wasn't going that hard. Like, at best, my heart rate would only hit like, upper 130s, low 140s, nasal breathing, relatively easy-ish. I would go on the bike and I would try to match the same heart rate again. And my DSATs are just hanging out at like in the 40s. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. And it's like, for people listening, I view the rower for leg stuff then, again, local data, that's actually much closer to weight training, right? Where you're stripping all the oxygen off like really, really fast. And my DSATs would stay down there. And I'm like, oh shit. So like rowing, even though my heart rate was about the same, like even RPE was around the same, but for that particular muscle group, at least for the legs or the quads, they're actually doing a lot more quote unquote work than if I did something like that on the bike. So when I switched to doing more stuff on the bike, cut down on the distance on the rower, then all of a sudden my legs recovered. I'm like, oh, it seems like kind of obvious, but I've been more kind of classically trained that oh, well, if your heart rate is the same, you know, your RP is around the same, it's got to be the same amount of work.
Mm-hmm.
But yet I knew that it could be different for different muscle groups. But I think having the actual data and looking at it, and I did this on multiple different days too. So it wasn't the same each day, but the trend was usually about a 20 difference between the two.
Yeah, which is pretty huge. And that's one thing I got from listening to a lot of Daniel's work. For example, for triathletes, you'll want to test them separately on the bike and on the run, because like you said, the work is different, right? The speed of contraction, the range of motion, all those things, your position as well, right? Whether you're standing up, sitting forward on a bike, sitting on the rower, all these things influence how your body is going to accommodate and do the work. Hence the need or the utility of having that inside look at what's going on at the muscle site.
Yeah, and people can do this too, like even if they just look at heart rate. So when I'm on the bike, and again, this could be related to the position of the heart rate strap, but I've tried different strap versions. If I bend over more, my heart rate will actually change. If I sit up more, it actually gets a little bit better. And people are like, oh, so if I'm not measuring output and I'm just thinking about training, that may be okay for training depending on what I'm wanting to do. The caveat is, again, you would have to measure that in a real life circumstance and measure output at the same time to see if that's even useful, right? Because I could extrapolate that data and say, oh yeah, all you crazy cyclists, you need to, you know, ride more upright. And everyone listening is going, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of in my life, right? Because now you have massive wind resistance.
Yeah.
But if you look at your performance on the bike, you would see your performance would drop then at that point, right? So I think sometimes we get carried away, myself included, using kind of surrogate markers of what's going on and then forgetting to measure the thing in a different circumstance. And again, still measuring output too, to see what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's where maybe Daniel's kind of testing approach comes in, where you will test with the Moxy and the heart rate. Then for that next training block, you can use heart rate as a proxy for your Moxy zones, right? So you can see when the SMO2 trend is going up, that's your zone 1. So you know your heart rate is between or under a certain value. Then you get your zone 2 when your SMO2 is flat. And then you got zone 3, zone 4 with different levels of, or different rates of desaturation. But it works for a while. And then you have to retest, because if your training is done properly, your zones are going to change, right? Which is really interesting.
Yeah. And the other way to get around that too is if you have like a Phoenix or something and it's running's a little bit easier to check your watch than it is rowing. You know, you can still do it. It's just a little different. Just throw a sensor on a few days and maybe train only to that specific amount, right? So what I've been trying to do on the rower now is I'm like, okay, so if I'm one of those people where for whatever reason, my SMO2 just plummets right away, I've been playing around with just mentally doing different things based on the feedback, right? To see, can I hold the same output, like a low output, like 200 watts, and can I actually get my DSAT paradoxically to go up? Can I get from the 20s to the 30s, right? And so in my head, I'm thinking if I can do that and I can hold the same output, I'm more efficient, right? So I'm getting a better relaxation when I have the rest phase of rowing, right? I'm just using general terms, that I can get more blood flow. I can change that DSAT. So that's something it seems very obvious now, but I didn't think of before, because my assumptions were, oh yeah, if you're training, you just want to hammer it as low as possible. Yeah. And there's days to do that. But if your goal at the end is to increase, say, a 5K or a 2K, you want to be as efficient as possible on each stroke. So I think training efficiency at a separate session, training more physical capacity on a separate session is probably a good way of trying to do it. And then hopefully they'll kind of, merge up at the end.
Yeah. Another big thing that came out for me using the Moxy more and more is how low of an output I need to be at, even on a bike erg, to see an upwards trend on that SMO2 line. And it's ridiculously slow. And so I guess the conclusion of that is everybody's probably riding just way too fast when they think they're going slow. They're actually not going that slow.
Yeah, and I was surprised too on the bike. Like I said, I was, unfortunately this past year has been kind of a shit show in terms of trying to test other people and get more data. But so at least on myself and just a handful of people, I was surprised that, to your point, how low and slow I actually had to go to see it kind of go up. And then the other part too was, in the past, I was not a big fan of warm-ups per se. It's like, yeah, I read all the research on it. I get it. Yeah. Just, warm up. Don't hurt yourself. You'll be fine. But to see, like, if I put the Moxy on cold, if I'm going to do like front squats, at best when I'm resting, I'm hitting like upper 60s, maybe low 70s. And then when I'm warmed up and everything is good, I'm hitting like the low 80s. And this is before doing any work. I'm like, oh shit, so it probably does matter more than I thought.
Yeah. If nothing else, you want your quote unquote battery to be as big and as full as possible before you start your session. If you don't, you're actually missing out on something there, and you should extend your warm up. That's something I've been trying to play with and adjust and figure out, okay, what do I actually need to get my SMO2 to 80 on the bike? So right now what I've found is if I do 4 or 5 minutes of easy riding and then ramp up progressively over 4 minutes, so I get to between 8 and 10, and then I do a couple bouts of 45 seconds hard. The first one pretty hard, the second one a little harder, and then I wait for 2 or 3 minutes, then I'm in the 80s, and then I'm good to start my session. But yeah, you actually have to start slower than you think, and you have to finish your warm-up stronger than you would have thought to actually get yourself ready for the work you're about to do.
Yeah, and I think that's really good to know depending on what you're doing, right? So if I'm going to do like a max 2K, then on the days I'm doing an actual test, then my warm-up is substantially longer. If I'm just doing low to moderate intensity stuff, I will just get on the thing cold in the morning and just start going, right? Exactly. Because I'm not as concerned about that all-out absolute performance. It's a low enough thing. I'm not going to hurt myself, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that makes a huge difference. But it gives you a way to quantify it and to know that, okay, this is a test day, or this is a day I need to be at a higher percentage output. It's going to take me about 5 minutes to warm up. Okay, cool. That's, totally worth the time investment on it.
Is there any other maybe details that you've garnered from looking at your data over the past few weeks, to maybe insights that you maybe hadn't noticed before, or nuances that came up?
Those are probably the main ones. I've been playing around with now trying to put another sensor on the other leg and look at differences. I think it's highly subjective to location. So my buddy Ben House and I were joking about this the other day. Like, even maybe for some biometric markers, maybe we need like just a permanent tattoo on your leg or something, so like you get like the same location all the time. That's probably not the world's best idea, but I think location and all that stuff makes a big difference because of some of the assumptions that go into it. But again, you're looking at data relatively to yourself, and if you've done enough testing, you kind of have an idea of where you're at. I am kind of surprised, and again, I would like to get more data on this and talk to others who have a lot more data. I just wonder about the testing of limiters. How much does that change on a day-by-day basis, right? So if we brought someone in like just like 3-4 days in a row, and we do 515 or whatever testing, just pick your thing, like, would we get a different analysis from that each day, right? Because what I've seen some days, just on myself and a handful of other people, is that some days like I can hit low 80% when I start and everything is great. Other days, like I do the same warm up, I do whatever, and like the best I get is like the upper 70s, so it's like, is my body using a different strategy on those different days? Like, so one day would I show up maybe having a true respiratory limitation, whatever that is, or that's a whole podcast in and of itself. Would I have a muscle limit maybe on another day, which again, that even discrepancy is debatable, because my gut feeling is that there's more variability there than what we think. And that doesn't mean that a lot of that testing is worthless at all. If someone has a major limitation, it'll probably show up each time. But again, I just wonder if the body is sort of clamped to that output, and you have a high level athlete who can hit that output on most days, day in and day out, my guess is that they may be using different strategies a little bit on each day in order to accomplish that. And then you get into the whole mess of, well, maybe that was fatigue because the first day they really had a true respiratory limitation and you just hammered them on that. And so now that's going to be a little bit more behind because it's more fatigue than a different system. And so now you're actually not testing the same thing you were testing before, even though you're trying to. And yeah, it just makes your head spin.
But I think it is interesting with those new technologies to try and play devil's advocate. While you were saying this, I was just thinking even temperature from one day to the next, you know,
Yeah.
and the impact on heart rate alone, and then the heart rate trend that we're going to be looking at, and whether it plateaus at the top or not for a quote unquote cardiovascular limitation, that might be affected as well by just, you know, the room you're in, or whether you're in the sun or in the shade or inside or outside.
Yeah, and even just, you know, different heart rate variability status each day. What's the status of your autonomic nervous system? You know, if you're more stressed acutely, but your chronic HRV is okay, meaning you could probably drop the hammer and, you know, get a good output that day. But are you using a slightly different strategy because you have a little bit more stress on board for whatever reason? You know, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that the future is taking some type of gauge, like putting a Moxy on and having an app or something to use to do more biofeedback type training, I think is kind of the future, right? Yeah, so you could have days, and, you know, other guys have talked about this too, that I'm just going to hammer my SO2 as low as I can, right? I'm going to do intervals. Aaron Davis has talked about this. Just hammer it as low as possible. I'm going to wait till it recovers, then I'm going to go again, right? And I'm going to hammer it again. And once it stops recovering within a certain amount of time, you know, then I'm done. Right, like Cal Dietz has talked about the same thing, using heart rate biometric method for training, right, or using velocity-based training. It's all the same idea. It's like, what quality are you taking? And now we have the ability to monitor that thing live. I think, to me, that's going to be almost maybe even more useful than some of the testing, because if your testing is a little bit different, it doesn't matter because you're watching that live thing all the time and you're training based on that. Again, assuming we have the right variable we're watching.
Yeah, and to your point on this, I remember Evan mentioning something that he did when he was training on the rower a lot. For 6 months straight, he did this exact same repeat desaturation, so kind of sprint intervals on, I think it was every Tuesday for 6 months. And he said from 1 week to the next, he was able to do sometimes 5 intervals before hitting his kind of failure criteria, sometimes 15, and then 3, and then 30, and there was no rhyme or reason, and he tried to figure it out. But again, to your point, there's a huge variability there, and like you said, maybe utilizing a tool like this, the testing aspect is super interesting, but I'm on your side when it comes to using it on a day-to-day basis as an auto-regulation tool and a monitoring tool. And that, I think that's really where it comes in full force, more than even just the testing side.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're looking at kind of so how I think of it is, okay, I can get performance live, great. Can I get a cost metric with that? Kind of, RPE, heart rate. But if I go one step under the hood, could I look at breathing changes, right? If I want to put on a full, you know, metabolic heart, RER changes, you know, all the other metrics you get from that, local changes. Yeah, because everyone who's trained long enough knows this happens, right? Like, you have some days you're like, your rest of your life is pretty good. Your training just sucked and you have no idea why. You can't figure it out. And then you're kind of disappointed. This happened to me when I was traveling and came back. And then, like, the week after I did the same thing again, I got like a lifetime PR, you know, and it's like, and there wasn't that much variability in my life. HRV was a little different, but not massively different, you know? So I just think there's a lot more, Devin's point too, there's a lot more variability in the underlying system than we understand. And you can either spend all your time trying to understand it and test it and do predictions of performance, which historically has been pretty shitty. Or you can just say, screw it. I'm just going to pick a couple things I'm going to look at each day, heart rate variability, sleep, whatever. And then I'm just going to go train whatever the highest quality capacity I could get at that point. And I don't need to know what that is because I will find it, right? It's like what Evan was saying. Okay, yeah, I hit my threshold. I only got 3 sets in. Okay, great. Oh, now I hit my threshold. I got 15, you know? And so I remember talking to Cal Dietz years ago at the U of M, and he's like 45 minutes, he's drawn out this entire whiteboard, and I was supposed to help him with an article about it. And at the end, I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, how the hell am I going to translate this into an article? We should have done a video. And so I looked at him, I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is all this is based on do the highest quality work first, and then repeat that as much as you can. And he kind of stares at me, and he's like, yes. And it's like, if most people just did that, it would be pretty good, you know, that would
They
be pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm definitely with you on that. Do you think that Moxy as a technology, as a wearable tool, is gonna kind of morph over the next few years, maybe decade, in the new kind of heart rate sensor? Is it gonna be democratized a lot more, in your opinion, or is it gonna remain something pretty maybe specific or specialized?
I don't know. I mean, my prediction, and I'm not the best at predictions, right? I'm pretty horrible at them. But like after I saw it, my prediction was like, oh my God, within like 2 or 3 years, like everyone's going to be doing this, and you know, it'll go to your watch and it'll go to an app and everyone will be, and it's like, nah, nobody cared. You know, it's like, oh, okay. A few people did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, then I'm like, well, you know, maybe it's the interface. And then at the end of the day, I think you're left with the technology has to get so simple that people can do it without understanding it, which again presents a whole host of other problems associated with it, because now you've got an over application of something people don't understand. Mm-hmm. Right? So look at heart rate variability, right? Initially, at least in the modern literature, 1968, the cosmonauts used it, I think. Mm-hmm. And then now it's almost showing up everywhere because the technology, you can get it off of the wrist, and it may or may not be accurate. That's a whole separate debate. But it's at the point where people get a number and they have no idea how they got it. Mm-hmm. But manufacturers will put it in everything now because, ooh, it's the marker of stress, right? So we've passed the point where it wasn't really used because people didn't understand it. A few hardcore people did. Then it was kind of at this sweet spot where only the people who kind of understand it were using it. And now it's kind of gone almost so far where everyone's abusing it for everything else. Mm-hmm. All right. My guess is that Moxy and other technologies will probably follow the similar path.
Yeah.
Right.
That's probably a big problem, considering the number of interpretations that you can have of the data itself. I mean, recently I did a test with a client, then we did a follow-up training session with the Moxy as well. And I kind of wrote out what I analyzed, what I saw, or what I thought I saw, and then sent it to 2 different people who have literally been doing this for, you know, years and years. And I got 2 completely different interpretations of the data that I had collected. So if still today, it's hard for the best of the best to, I mean, have a consensus or think in the same way. It just shows how complicated it is on an underlying level, and how, like you said, maybe having it go to everybody and use it in a very simplistic way might not be the best way to leverage that technology.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to and they have a fair amount of research on Moxy, but there's not as much on the application to drive training, right? And I could say that about any device too. I'm not just picking on them. You know, that's common across the industry, right? So if we agree on an assessment, okay, so let's say we train and we hammer our DSAT every day and we do like an auto-regulated thing versus a standard protocol. Does the auto-regulated show up to actually be better in terms of an outcome? Mm-hmm. I would say probably yes, but I can't point to any hard data that says that. Mm-hmm. Right? Even using heart rate variability, which has been around even longer in terms of auto-regulated training via HRV, is it better or not? I would say in general, most of the data says that it's better, but if you read the abstracts, you'd probably disagree with that. Because again, what is your definition of better? To me, if I got the same output and got it, like one study showed 2 weeks earlier, cool, that's a win, right? That's a whole nother 2 weeks I'd have to train that particular athlete. Mm-hmm. Someone else could read it and say, well, it doesn't matter. At the end of the study, they both got to the same result. Mm-hmm. You know, so again, a lot of it goes back to interpretation, and it's like genetics. Like people are like, oh, I want to do this genetic test, and it says that Bob here wants to be an Olympic bobsled pusher. He's got slow twitch fibers mostly. Oh, poor Bob. Like maybe for screening, maybe, ethics aside. But what if Bob does really want to train for that? And his whole goal is to be an Olympic level athlete to the highest caliber he can. Maybe he doesn't have the best genetics, but what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to have him do like 1x20 and not have him train speed and power? His sport is speed and power. So I don't know how that changes the variable of training. And that's the hard part, is because we don't have any data to suggest which way to go. And that's kind of where we're at right now. I think it's better. I think it's definitely going to be useful, but what exact protocol does that look like, right? And everyone's kind of has their own favorites that they do, and a lot of it works, really well. There's just nothing else to compare it to.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess time will tell in that regard. You mentioned a couple times already the PNOE unit, so metabolic cart, allowing you to measure all things, everything that's going on the respiratory side. So can you talk a little bit about that tool and how you've used it so far?
Yeah. So my research I did on metabolic flexibility was, how well does your body use carbohydrates? How well does it use fat? How well does it switch back and forth? So what we were trying to find was, can we do a non-invasive test to determine metabolic flexibility? Right. So we could enroll people, we could, jam a piss ton of insulin in one arm and a piss ton of glucose in the other arm, do like an IV, like it's called the clamp study, see what's going on. We could give you 80 grams of dextrose and poke your finger a bunch of times, see how well you can handle carbohydrates. But trying to figure out fat use is a little bit harder. But we know with indirect calorimetry, metabolic carts, we get the RER, right, respiratory exchange ratio, and that tells us with each breath on a fancier cart, how much percentage of that is fat, how much percentage of that is carbohydrates. So everybody knows, okay, we can do a max exercise test. You start out using fat, and at the end, hey, you start using a lot of carbohydrates. The caveats with those two things is that some people, if you just pull them in off of the street and measure them under rest or even low intensity exercise, the assumption in like every physiology textbook known to man is that they all use fat really well because they're nice, healthy individuals. What you find is that's not true. Some do, some don't, right? So like Helge did a study on that. I did one study. Gadecki did one study. And what you see is that the variability is like 23 to 93% at lower intensities, meaning some people are really good. Yeah, it's massive. Some people are really good at using fat. Other people are not. Now, some people may argue if you're a competitive athlete, I don't give a shit because their output is the same. I'd say that's probably true for performance, but I think for health and some other longevity of the athlete, it's still something worth looking at. So we're like, okay, but not everyone who maybe, if we go into not super metabolically healthy, they're probably not going to, want to do a max treadmill test. Two, they may have some risk factors, especially get into cardiovascular disease, stuff like that. So could we do something with a submax test that tells us variability in fuel systems without having them go to a max exercise test? Could we have it be completely non-invasive so we don't have to poke them and get bloods and start IVs? So what we did is, if anyone who's looked at metabolic cart data, you put someone on and you do steady state exercise, and after you've done hundreds of these, you get kind of bored anyway. So you just kind of stare at the screen because you're afraid the device is going to shit the bed and screw all your data. So you kind of watch it the whole time to make sure that doesn't happen. And then you'll see the RER starts moving around in some people, right? It'll be like 0.75, 0.77, 0.74, 0.76. It kind of oscillates around this number. And at first we're like, well, maybe that's the machine, right? Maybe the machine is generating this variability. And what we realized was, well, why does it go away on some other people then? Same day, same machine, same calibration, same conditions, same baseline to percentage of max, everything else is the same. Then we're like, well, wait a minute. Maybe that is a physiologic system, right? Just like looking at heart rate variability, your heart rate moves around a little bit at rest. So maybe the RER moves around a little bit in people who are more metabolically flexible. So we did a study where we enrolled people, we baselined them, did all this stuff. And we said, okay, let's take the same math to analyze variability from heart rate, and let's apply that to a variability in RER. And what we showed is that this is a stable measurement. You can take the same person, have them come back in the lab a couple of times, and you'll get the same result, right? So at least the system for measuring that is stable enough that it doesn't change all the time. Or what's called the gauge R and R. Unfortunately, we didn't get any further than that. So does that RER variability mean someone is more metabolically flexible or not? Maybe, maybe not. So that's how I got into metabolic cart usage. And then I always, from that point on, like wanted one because I'm like, oh, look at all the different things we can test and all the cool things you can do. And then I talked to the PNOE guys early on and they said, oh, we have one coming out. And so I ended up buying it. And what I liked is I wanted something that was breath by breath and something that you could actually calibrate against a known gas, what's called gas cal, which they have, which is great. And it's been pretty useful, and it's nice that it's portable, right? So I don't have to have this huge, $50,000 machine I wheel around and keep temperature controlled and all that kind of stuff. I can put it on people and have them go do runs, which I did that a few months ago, which I've stopped doing because cars and people almost got in accidents taking pictures because it looks like you're wearing like the world's worst like biohazard mask on. So I had a minivan drive by, like turn around on the road as I'm wearing it, like stick the phone out the window, like take a picture and like turn around again. So I'm like, oh crap, now I'm scaring all the neighbors and shit. But yeah, it's nice that you can actually have a way of measuring it. You can measure RMR, you can measure individual RER. So yeah, so it actually has been pretty useful. I don't have any disclosures with them or anything like that. So
did you gain any specific insights by using it on people training with it?
A little bit. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to test as many people as what I'd like because this past year's just been interesting to say the least. One thing that I have done some testing for is a max 2K and then comparing that to what the Concept 2 site says for your VO2 max and comparing that versus the device. And again, super low number, just a handful of people. That actually appears to be relatively accurate. And again, they did a study on that too. So it was actually based on real data. Yeah, so that was been pretty good. I've noticed like RER will change a fair amount, and then that gets into, did you have higher calories the day before? Were your carbs higher? There's a lot more, I think, variability going on with that. What I've been trying to play around with more lately is looking at breathing frequency.
Yeah.
And I mean, Aaron Davis may have said this a long time ago, and I probably just stole it from him, but I think people get stuck in a said breathing frequency, and that may be a limiter. So I don't know if it's necessarily gas exchange per se, and you will see it change. It's not that it doesn't change, but that's something I've been wondering about too. And I think Daniel may have even said this too, but you can almost see where people train because everything will look nice and smooth, and like heart rate kind of drops down, the rhythm looks good, watts are pretty good. And then when they kind of go above and below that zone, it just doesn't look as, I guess, a lack of a better word, to be coordinated, right? You see more exponential changes. You see more breath changes faster than the change in the load, right? It just looks like they're losing efficiencies outside of those zones. And so then I'll just be like, hey, train lower than that, train higher than that. And they're like, oh, but I don't want to do that. That sucks. I'm like, yep, exactly. I'm guessing you probably are in this zone most of your training. Well, I don't really know. Okay, put a heart rate strap on, go do some training. Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I was in that zone most of the time.
Yeah, that's something that Daniel talked about and illustrated really well in, he made a presentation for the Moxy YouTube channel. And he
cool.
Using VO2 and Moxy together over a 515 to get the perfect picture, or the complete picture, not perfect.
Yes.
Complete picture of what's going on. And that's exactly what he was saying, where some people are doing fine until they hit, for example, 45 breaths per minute. And then all of a sudden their tidal volume drops significantly, and minute ventilation goes out the window as well as a result. And so then you know that, hey, this is something you need to work on from a specific side, as in train your coordination, try to maintain a certain volume at those different frequencies, which is maybe a good segue to start talking about respiratory limitations. So today's episode is sponsored by Strength Coach Network, the #1 education and networking platform for strength and conditioning coaches. Strength Coach Network offers over 200 hours of video education delivered by elite level presenters such as Dan Pfaff, Jada Mayo, Derek Hansen, Carl Dietz, and Buddy Morris. If you work with or want to work with team sport athletes and take your coaching to the next level, you will find everything you need to know on topics such as speed development, plyometric training, conditioning, rehab, program design, and much, much more. Strength Coach Network also allows you to interact with hundreds of coaches from all over the world, ranging from top NFL, NBA, and MLB coaches all the way to the grassroots level. You can ask questions, respond to popular threads, and get valuable insight from the best in the business. Strength Coach Network also covers career and business development tailored specifically for coaches. If you want a resume critique, need to get ready for an interview, or are looking for professional networking advice, go to strengthcoachnetwork.com/upside to get your first month at half price. That's strengthcoachnetwork.com/upside. Have you been able to assess any of those so far between the Moxy and the PNOE unit?
The honest answer is I have no idea. I mean, I started initially, that's why I wanted both, right? Because in my head, I'm like, okay, if someone has a respiratory limitation, then maybe we could figure this out. And then the more I keep looking at it, the more I think at some point the respiratory system is going to be a limiter, but is that a limiter because they just haven't trained there? Or is it a physiologic limiter? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if I just have someone do higher intensity work that's not used to it, and I can watch them and make sure their breathing is better, and especially on a rower, I can watch their movements, because I know, like, on some of my early testing, and I'm by far not the greatest rower at all, but if I did like a hard 2K, at the end, I just looked like a spazzed out monkey on meth. You know, it was just a disaster.
I think that's the same for most people.
And I just tip off the rower at the end. I want to kill myself. And I'm like, oh, that was a max test. You know, but then you look at some of the world record on YouTube, and I can't remember the kid's name. And he's working hard, and his form is just dead nuts perfect. But if you saw the beginning and you saw the end, like, you wouldn't really know where he was, right? And then at the end, he's fatigued, but he's not like crawling off the roller, like throwing up in the corner. You know, it's like you watch Usain Bolt run a world record 100, 200 meter. Yeah, it looks like, whatever. You know, it's like, oh, maybe I should be training more coordination first, making sure form is good, all this other stuff, and then try to worry about what the limiter is. Because the hard part is, even if you assessed, and let's say this person has a respiratory limiter. Okay. Maybe in the case of a high level athlete where they have really maxed out how much exercise they can do, maybe respiratory training on top of that may be useful, because I can train something without the underlying physiologic stress. But for honestly, like, most people I train, like, you just need to train more and just higher quality, you know? And then it even gets into, if I look at it, how would I look at and determine what is a respiratory limiter, right? Do I assume that if blood is changing to the deltoid, that's a respiratory limiter? Do I assume if it's a change in frequency or minute ventilation output? Or is that they just haven't trained it, you know? So, well, I don't know. I've gone like everywhere known to man, and right now I have no idea.
I guess you could call it a respiratory system limitation, just like you call a muscular limitation if the person hasn't done enough strength training, enough high intensity work. You would call that a metabolic limitation. To the same coin, you could say that they have a respiratory limitation if it's ultimately their respiratory system that's limiting their absolute performance, as in you maybe see a decrease in SMO2, like you said. Tidal volume goes out the window after a certain respiratory frequency, which, like you said, means they need to train that specifically. I'm interested about the respiratory training in and of itself as a specific means of preparation, in the sense that it allows you to really target that system without applying any extra stress to the other parts, right? Because if you do want to maximally train your respiratory system, you need to go there. Like, you can't just be in zone 2 and then be like, I'm doing respiratory training. You have to actually go there. So do you see that as a viable means of maybe adding some training components without overloading the athlete in terms of global load management?
Yeah, I mean, I think in theory it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, I agree 100% absolutely with what you're saying. The hard part is, in practice, I don't know what would tell me when to do that and at what level I would do that, right? So how I would set it up is, just old school, boring, linear ass periodization with their training plan, and we're just going to push it more week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. And once you hate life, you don't want to look at a rower, and you want to fire me and your HRV goes in the shitter. Okay. If I think we're going to hold that volume and leave you right on the razor's edge, maybe I would add some respiratory training at that point, because I feel like I've maxed out all these other systems. because the thing I don't know is, what is the transfer, right? So is the transfer of you sitting at rest, using a Spiro Tiger or NX device or whatever device? And if you talk to people who do this, like, they swear that it transfers, and I believe them. But would you get a better benefit by just having them do some type of extra training at that point then too? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, if you look at like Dempsey's stuff, I know you had on the podcast, it was great. Like, if you look at his stuff on respiratory muscle training, man, it is like, in some athletes, like, I've been to presentations and talked to the authors who did, like, soccer players was one of them. They did respiratory muscle training in one group, the other group they did not. The VO2 max went up by like 30% or some ungodly number in trained athletes, which is just astronomical. And you're like, cool. I'm like, how did you know who to intervene with what? And they're like, no, we just did it. We just split them in half, and this group did it. And then you look at other studies, and the poor bastards are doing, 20, 30 minutes of breath work a day or whatever, and didn't get any better. Which goes back to, okay, the argument then is, okay, well, you're doing it to people who don't have a respiratory limitation, so you wouldn't expect any transfer. But what I'd like to see is a study that says, hey, we're going to use XYZ method and say, okay, you group of like 40 soccer players or whatever, we're going to take you and we're going to say, okay, you have a respiratory limit, you do not have a respiratory limit by whatever method. We're going to split them. The respiratory limited people will train using some type of respiratory limited training. The other group, maybe they do a little more training or no training at all, and then see, is there any difference, right? Because at the end of the day, if it's an elite level athlete and they get 2% better by doing respiratory muscle training, they'll do it all day, right? To the average person, like even a higher level athlete, it's a harder sell to be like, bro, just breathe in and out of this device and it's going to feel like you're working hard, but you're not really exercising, and some athletes will do that, some won't, but if I'm going to tell that athlete to do that in addition to everything else they're doing, I don't know. I just want, for me personally, I just want a little bit more data and something to know that this is probably going to transfer for that person.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Just like now knowing what we know, where obviously you don't need to be metabolically limited to do interval training, just so that we're
right
to do sprint training and like heavy DSAT stuff, but obviously people that are going to have one of those limitations are going to benefit from it virtually more, right? And if you pile on a bunch of repeat sprint work to someone who's got a cardiac limitation, you're just making the problem worse in a sense, which goes back to your initial point of, you need to be able to test for that. You need the test to be reliable. And from there, now you can prescribe the right training for the right person so that they get better at that point in time. So yeah, I'm with you on the study that needs to first test for limiters and then see if the responders, non-responders to respiratory training matches up with their limitation profile, I guess.
Yeah. And so what I do in practice then is I go kind of backwards and like, okay, you may have a biochemical limitation or you have a biomechanical limitation, right? So I'll do like in person, I'll put them on the table and I just stand in the corner. Of course, everyone listening to this will know what I'm doing now, but I was standing in the corner. I'm like, okay, just take a few breaths. I'm just watching them breathe, right? And all I'm looking for is, does the rib cage expand 360 degrees? Do they have some belly movement, not massive belly movement, because the diaphragm's going to push the viscera down. And then that's what I'm looking for. And to me, if they don't have a good breathing pattern, they can't get air into all the way, top part of their lungs, their neck doesn't do this all the time, until their mechanics are better, I don't give any rat's ass about breath training at all, right? It's just like you would not load someone who squats like a baby deer trying to stand up. You're not going to put 400 pounds on them and go, just stand up, right? You're going to figure out a way of improving their mechanics or change the lift or do something else first before you're going to load them. So I think in this rush to look at what is a respiratory limiter, maybe it's just shitty biomechanics to start with. And so that's where I would look at first. And then I have seen huge differences doing that. Right, so I'll do primarily the activated training or RPR, reflexive performance reset. Basically, just do everything around the rib cage. I'll do some visceral work, hands-on stuff, and a lot of times HRV changes, breathing changes, heart rate will drop for the same clamped output of work. So that's kind of where I would back up and start from there. And I agree with those athletes who have good breath mechanics and everything else. At some point, maybe get to the point where you have to kind of split and look at respiratory limitations or not. Maybe, and that's probably true.
Yeah, that's definitely that's the approach that Daniel recommends, is look at the structure first. Can they move their rib cage? Can they take a full breath? Do they have the full FVC that they should? Do they have FEV, which you can quickly test with spirometry, and then go from there, right? And if you don't address this underlying structural issue, he calls it a capacity issue. You don't want to touch the capability, which is what he coins it. So like the applied side of breathing. I guess that's one of the fascinating sides for me about the respiratory system as a whole, is that it has all of those different facets to it, right? You've got the volume that you have available, the power of your exhale, the mobility of your rib cage, potentially your infrasternal angle presentation can have some influence on that as well.
Sure.
And all those different things, plus the functional side, if we may still use this term, which kind of, like you said, it's more complicated than just give respiratory training to everybody and the world will be a better place for it.
Yeah, because I think about even like exercise cueing. So like 10 years ago, I was like really big into internal cues, and I just cued the shit out of everybody, which was a disaster probably 10, 15 years ago. Poor bastards. Sorry, anyone I trained then in person, I apologize. And then I read some stuff, Gabriel Wolf stuff on external cues of like, what is the thing that you want the brain to do, right? If you're doing a press overhead, push towards the ceiling, right? Don't worry about trying to feel your lat the entire time. You find performance goes up. So I'm like, oh, okay. And so then I started doing some stuff with RPR, be activated. So now I'm like, okay, just come in here. If you're training here, get on the table. We did this with the guy last year. Do warm up a deadlift. Great. Gets up to like 315. He's like, I got 3. You could see him kind of being shifted a little forward. He's like, I never feel my hamstrings or glutes. I'm like, okay. Put him on the table. Just old school Kendall stuff, manual muscle testing, which I know has its pros and cons. But all you're really looking at is, do I feel like the muscle's working the way it should be or not? Like nothing beyond that, nothing crazy. Do some stuff, get all the muscles working the way that they should. Great. Go back to the gym. I give him the exact same cues, same warm up, same everything. And he did like 3 more reps. His shin angle actually went back. And the next day he's like, oh my God, my hamstrings and glutes were so sore for like 3 days. And I didn't give him any cues. I didn't cue him anything different at all. I just gave his body the ability to function and hit activation where it needed to. So I just wonder, like, the more that we get the body to function the way that it should, and then we just get the hell out of the way and let it do what it's supposed to do, my guess is we're going to be better off. And so in the back of my head, I always keep thinking about this of, okay, I got them better breathing mechanics. I showed them how to maintain that themselves. We're watching their mechanics on the rower or whatever output. We're seeing output. We're seeing heart rate. Maybe do some Moxy. Maybe do some PNOE stuff. At some point, do I just need to give them a better cue or figure out what their limitation is and not segment everything out so far and train one thing up that I may make it disjointed?
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And maybe going back, I see a parallel there between kind of the let's say the separation that Daniel talks about in the respiratory system, with you have the structure and then you have the function. And same thing with the body. You have the structure, right? The actual skeleton's position, and like you said, the way it's going to influence how everything functions in the body. And then you have the applied, which is more the metabolics, or the bioenergetic side of things. And in the same way, you need both of those boxes to be ticked if you want everything to work optimally. You can't do one without the other. They go together.
Yes. Yeah. And they're both like intertwined, right? So what I've noticed, and I don't have enough data to show this at all, but if you get better muscle function just on the table, and I have someone then do rowing and I stuff a Moxy on them, their ability to relax the muscle appears to get better. Right. And so in my head, I'm thinking, okay, if they had a rectus femoris that's just overworking all the time, trying to do hip flexion and not the psoas, if I put them on a rower, what makes me think that that's going to be able to relax instantly between, each stroke? Probably not, because it's on all the time, because it feels like it has to do all that work. When we change that pattern, or at least by manual muscle testing, it appears we've changed it. the Moxy data appears to get a little bit better then too, right? It appears to relax better in between contractions. And again, this is all hypothetical and of like 3 people and that type of thing. But their output was better. The heart rate was a little bit lower. The metrics kind of moved in the right direction. So something was happening, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me of Aaron Davis's triad of structure, function, and energetics. And they all work together. There's no one that functions without the other. And like you said, it's a loop. It's all intertwined. And I guess we have to talk about things in isolation so our tiny little brains can figure things out. But really, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, and that I think will also shift dynamically depending upon the load, the exercise, the condition, the stress level, all that stuff. And that's what makes it hard, right? Because back to what we were saying about variability in testing, you know, like who knows, maybe one day is a little bit different than the next, and how do you figure out what's best for that day? I think like we said, I think you find it by using some select metrics, and I just think we're so far away from prediction of performance. It's just kind of crazy.
Yeah, and maybe taking that one step farther on the systemic side, can you talk about homeostatic regulators and how you see those play into everything that we've mentioned so far?
Yeah. So in my brain, I'm like, okay, so we have an athlete that comes in, and this is more online stuff, or just as an organism. Let's say their nutrition's pretty good, their training's good, their sleep's good, like all their basic stuff is, you know, pretty in place, mechanics are good. Like, what's the next level then, right? Maybe we get into respiratory training, maybe get into more Moxy testing, blood work, whatever. I'm like, okay, so if your body is organized via survival, which is my bias, I think your body's going to do whatever it possibly can in order to survive, right? And that may be conscious or even unconscious a lot of times. Okay, if that's true, then we need to teach the body to survive better to get the next level of performance. Okay, well, how the hell do we figure out what that is then, right? They have all the kind of basics in order. Like, okay, so what things does the body then have to 100% hold within a very tight range, or you're dead, right? I'm like, okay, so the main one's probably temperature, right? So 98.6 for Fahrenheit for people in the US. You can only go a couple degrees of core temperature above or below that. And if you do, and you get out of that range, then you're dead, right? Your survival, that's it. Right? So your body is probably going to do everything possible to hold that, right? So temperature is a homeostatic regulator. However, we know people can do exposure to, you know, sauna. There's people who've ran across friggin' Death Valley in the US. There's a whole race for it. You know, it's crazy. But if people run across deserts in the Sahara, they run in the winter. I have a cold water exposure of 37 degrees of water. I go sit in just because I think it's useful. Right? So we know that for short periods of time in controlled fashion, we can go into other extremes. And we know we can train for the ability to actually handle that, right? Everyone's seen, you know, if you have ever done a bigger race and you're from like Minnesota in the winter, and you have to show up to, say, Costa Rica and train there in like March, it's brutal because you are not used to that humidity and heat at all. But even just being there a few, you know, like 7-10 days, it gets better, right? Your body has a capacity to adapt to different environments. So I'm like, okay, so maybe then training those particular homeostatic regulators will allow you to be a more robust, anti-fragile organism that can handle a wider variety of stressors, right? So another one would be pH. We know that if you get on the rower, for example, I'm just beating on the rower now, and do like a 500-meter test, yeah, that's going to be a lot of lactic acid, right? Which is lactate and hydrogen ions, right? You literally are dumping acid, hydrogen ions, into the muscle. That's literally what you are doing. But your body has mechanisms of buffering that, intracellular, extracellular, carnosine, that kind of stuff, that can buffer that and try to keep that pH, you know, right around, it's not exactly 7, but right around there, right? We got the same thing with blood glucose. We got the same thing with oxygen and carbon dioxide. So I think then if you look at all of these as a system, that gives you a way of trying to pick what are the things you're going to target. And then also, when do you maybe not want to do something? right? So if you look at the literature on cold water immersion immediately after training for hypertrophy, it's about 3 studies now, pretty well done, showing that it does blunt hypertrophy to some degree. Now, we don't know exactly how much that is in terms of scale weight, but the caveat is it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit or less, 10 to 15 minutes, and it's done immediately after training. So if you're doing that, probably not the best idea. So it gives us a framework to say, okay, once you've maxed out your good training, I think that training these systems will give you that next level and make you more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to your point, the way because I recently listened to a bit more of Wim Hof's material, and the main thing I got out of it, besides the go beyond what you're capable of, et cetera, which it's all great. Like I have nothing against it, but really what spoke to me was, all right, you get in the cold shower. What's the effect of that? It's a stressor on one of the biggest organ in your body, which is your skin. And like we apply a stress in the gym that allows us to go beyond that and then tolerate higher loads and higher training volumes, while getting into the cold shower every day or once every few days, you get that reminder that this is a possibility. You need to adapt to it. And as a result of that, everyday life, everyday temperatures is going to be a lot more tolerable because your range is now much bigger, right? If you go cold showers and saunas, now you have the full range of possibilities and your body can easily play with the average temperatures. Same thing with this breathing technique, kind of thinking about what's happening there. Well, what's going on is you're doing a bunch of long or prolonged exhales and breaths, kind of over ventilating, essentially, blowing out all of your CO2, which lowers your kind of lowers your CO2 levels, to speak simply. And then when you hold your breath, you're going to be able to wait a lot longer before you reach your CO2 threshold, which is going to expose you to a more hypoxic environment than you could have reached without that lesser CO2 to begin with. And again, hypoxic environment, stressor on the body, at a systemic level, at a cellular level. And that, again, is something that we adapt from, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think the other part too is just the psychological aspect of it, that I am picking to do the harder thing in a controlled environment where I know I'm not going to be unsafe. I'm not going to be an idiot, but I've been doing it for like a year and a half. Like crawling into cold water is never fun. Like you get in initially and you know what to expect. So you're better at the initial expect. I don't yell screaming for 2 minutes now as much, but it doesn't feel good. Right. And your brain goes through this weird process of knowing this doesn't feel good, but using my prefrontal cortex to go, okay, but I know it has these other benefits. I'm choosing to do this. It's a controlled thing. I'm not in any, unsafe environment. However, your limbic kind of lizard brain is like, no, cold water for too long, you die. Like, don't do this. This is a stupid idea. But I think using your prefrontal cortex to kind of override your limbic system is a habit you can learn to do. And I think for even people who are not athletes, that's going to be a very powerful skill, especially in the future, right? Because everyone's going to be targeting your limbic brain probably better than you even know. Right, from Facebook ads to hitting a button on your phone and food shows up at your door to, life has just become so easy that we're kind of giving up some of that. So I think choosing to do the hard thing, like choosing to do high intensity exercise, or for people who love high intensity exercise, doing more low to moderate intensity exercise, all those things, I think those are skill sets you can then build up and transfer to other aspects of your life too.
Yeah, I like the way you articulated that. Talking again about physiological flexibility, could you define that term, or how you define it?
Yeah, so research I started with was in metabolic flexibility, and then a couple of years after that, I was like, oh, can we apply like these same principles to physiology at a systemic level? So I just called it physiologic flexibility because it kind of fit. Sort of a made-up term, but if we look now, there's metabolic flexibility, there's psychological flexibility, there is flexibility within different systems, right? Depending upon, you can look at the concept of hormesis, gets thrown out a lot. Hormesis was originally more of a a pharmacology type term, that if we give you a little bit of stress, your body can handle it and it's more resilient to it. You can look in the cardiac realm of like ischemic preconditioning, which is probably what's just some of the benefits of aerobic exercise are. Blood flow restriction training is similar for muscles, where we're kind of restricting venous outflow for a period of time. And we know that if all those are done in a controlled fashion, the body generally gets better. But I think with modern society, we're running the inverse experiment. We're running the experiment of what happens when we had these things relatively present for most of our course of history, and now we don't, right? Because people are like, well, you live in Minnesota, it's cold there. I'm like, yeah. I mean, I have a heated gym now, which is 45 degrees, which is amazing compared to what it was before, but it's not super warm, right? But most people, even here, run from one preheated place to their preheated car. They've got the remote car starter on that's been started 10 minutes before they leave, to, you know, run into a job or back to their, you know, house again to work from home or whatever. So we're running the experiment, at least with temperature and other things, that we don't have much exposure to it. And we know that physiologic systems, when we remove a lot of the stressors, it's not very good for them, right? We chuck you into outer space and put you in microgravity. If you're not actively doing some type of countermeasure, like your bone loss accelerates like crazy. Like there's some early cosmonauts who still don't have like all their bone mass back because a lot of it was not effective countermeasures. You know, fluid shifts, muscle loss, all that kind of stuff. So we're currently running the experiment to see what happens if we remove a lot of these other stressors. We don't know what's going to happen. My guess is probably not going to be good. But we do know that it doesn't take much training, because if you haven't been exposed to much temperature difference, maybe just taking a 5-minute walk where you're just a little bit cold, like don't give yourself frostbite, don't be an idiot, you know, just be a little bit cold. I think that might have some benefit. And then the super interesting part that I haven't seen anyone talk about yet is that there is positive cross adaptation and appears to be transfer between the homeostatic regulators. And there's only like a handful of research studies that even looked at this. But one of them, they did a group and they gave, well, one person they did cold water exposure. The other group they did not, just one exposure. And then they exposed both groups to hypoxia, right? So low oxygen. The group that had the cold water exposure did better under the hypoxic condition. And you're like, what the hell? Like at face value, like that doesn't even make sense, right? Because the systems appear to be so separate, but they're not as separate as what we think, right? There's different cellular factors that are probably responsible for that. So I think the future is trying to figure out, okay, great. So you got better at temperature regulation. Cool, you're better at that, right? SAID principle, we know that's better. But what other benefits do we see that maybe we didn't really look for, right? So like cold water exposure, I've noticed, is really good, I think, on the metabolic side from blood sugar regulation, perhaps. Beiging of some of the white fat cells to be more brown or beige adipose tissue. People can do this if they have cold water exposure. Like I got in, my blood glucose was like 85. I think it was at a temp of like 42 for like 4 minutes. And when I got out, it was like 56. I've done that a couple times. Now, again, I don't know. I don't have tracers to know where it went, but it definitely dropped. So I think training those areas, we'll see benefits in other areas that we just don't quite understand yet or haven't even looked for.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's a stretch to draw that parallel, but going back to our prior conversation on structure, function, and energetics, again, all those influence each other, right? And if you have some input on the nervous system is going to have an input on the bioenergetics and how that functions. So again, we're back to everything is connected, to speak very simply. And one thing is always going to have an influence on probably many, many, many other things that we can't even measure and maybe we'll never be able to.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of, I think, what has been put out of cold exposure and that kind of stuff is unfortunately not very accurate. It would be way easier for me to sell a certification and say that, hey, bro, if you go in the sauna, your growth hormone will go up by like 1,700%. And I can show legit human subject studies that actually happened. The downside is, does that mean anything for fat loss or muscle growth? No, it doesn't, because a spike is so short-lived that it just doesn't really matter that much. You know, the amount of cold exposure you need to see significant fat loss is very high, and it's just horrible. It's like sitting in a room that's like 55 degrees for hours on end. You're shivering. Well, you will see fat loss with that. Is anyone in the right mind really going to do that? Probably not. Just don't eat a Twinkie, you know? So that's the downside, is all of the really sexy stuff, there is still some mechanisms, there's still some stuff there. But I think all those things are beneficial, but maybe not for the reasons that they've been sold to be beneficial.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mike, I have a couple last questions for you today. I know you have a call starting soon. They're both from Evan. He chimed in with questions. So the first one is, what are you currently researching, and what's the thing you're most interested in diving to next?
So right now, I'm actually trying to figure out a lot of the respiratory stuff you had talked about. Shout out my buddy James Serby, did a really good course called the Oxygen course, which goes all the way back to like first principles of everything. So I'm kind of going through that and just looking and playing around with stuff to figure out like what's actually going on. Like, so one of the main questions I'm trying to figure out, and I think I figured it out, is like simple stuff. Like, okay, so if I'm doing exercise and it's higher intensity, where does the carbon dioxide come from? Like in the equations, like where does it actually come from? Like where can I go back and trace where each, carbon dioxide comes off each set of equations? And so what does that mean if you're using different fuel systems, right? Even stuff like carbon dioxide tolerance. Like, what does that even mean? Right? Does that mean you can do a longer breath hold? Okay, but there's a lot of stuff going on during a breath hold, like especially if you start feeling your diaphragm wanting to contract, mentally practicing being okay with your diaphragm starting to spasm out as you're lying on the floor, right? Or are we looking at capnography? Are we looking at output from metabolic cart? But those are two different things because they're not the exact same thing, or they're trying to get to the same thing. But, stuff like that at face value, you're like, well, it seems kind of simple, but I think in that process, maybe I'll figure out something different, or for all I know, like people like Evan and Aaron and everyone else is like, yeah, bro, we did that like 10 years ago. We already know the answer. Just chill out. So that's what I'm trying to figure out right now. And then you had a second question too that I spaced out.
The follow-up was what are you wanting to dive into next once you figure out all of that?
Yeah, once I figure all of that. So I've been more or less just trying to look at, I guess you'd say, the bigger picture of just integration of stuff. Because I've always been interested in like, how do you figure out like what is the next thing, right? So if I figured out, I think it's physiologic flexibility. Is there more data to show that, right? Can we show maybe some type of training studies to see that there actually is transfer with that? And then also some stuff related to probably RPR, deactivated, like hands-on stuff, which I've done a fair amount of. Like what the hell is actually going on? Because I don't know, but it seems to be beneficial. And I have sort of all these weird working theories of what might be going on. But yeah, probably going back and just doing a lot more testing in that area. They had a few studies that I was helping with that were set up before COVID stuff, but they've all been kind of shut down for now. So we may not have a lot of hardcore research-based work from that. But just again, it goes all the way back to our main discussion. Like I've always been to me, like human performance is like the ultimate problem to solve. And it's never ending. Like you're never going to figure all of it out. I'm never going to figure any of that out stuff in my lifetime. But especially like where Evan is too, like in the CrossFit realm, to me, like CrossFit for performance from human physiology is probably like the ultimate problem, right? Because you have all aspects. You've got strength, you've got cardio capacity, you've got all this stuff, high volume. Just trying to figure out, okay, for this athlete, is it a respiratory limitation? Do they just not have a big enough engine? Or do they just weak as a kitten? Are they actually strong, but maybe their activations are all just screwy, so they keep getting injured all the time? Like they're strong enough to actually injure themselves.
Yeah.
You know, like what is the, you kind of do this, then that, to try to get them going in the right direction in the fewest steps possible.
Yeah, the flow chart.
That'll be like never ending. Yeah.
A closing question for you. You'll appreciate that one. What is your favorite album of August Burns Red?
Ooh, August Burns Red. One of my favorite bands. They were just on NCIS Los Angeles. They're playing in this jail scene with like crazy death metal, so that was pretty cool to see. I don't know. I have a poster of the Phantom Anthem tour, and at first I didn't like that album, but the more I listened to it, I actually really liked it. So currently, that may be one of my favorites now, but it changes all the time. If I had to pick one, I would say any live album they have is probably the best. The new one, Guardians, I'm still getting into. Like, there's some songs on there I really like, and then other songs I'm like, can't get quite into it yet. But yeah, even Messengers, like the early ones are good. Like, yeah, pretty much all of them. I can't really pick a bad one, so that's hard to say.
Awesome. Mike, where can people find you on social?
Probably Facebook. I think it's under Mike T. Nelson. Instagram is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. So DrMikeNelson. And then the best place is probably the newsletter. That's where I do probably most of my writing. Just go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. There'll be a way they can get on the wait list there. And then the main site with everything else that runs through is just MikeTNelson.com. There'll be a way to get on the newsletter there too.
Awesome. Well, both links are in the description and the show notes. Mike, it was a great pleasure chatting with you today.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much for all the good questions and the discussion and being open-minded, and just, I appreciate anyone who asks good questions and actually does testing on their own too, because it's nice to see the evolution of people actually having data now. Even if we don't agree, we can at least look at the data and see what's going on, where 10, 15 years ago, that was exceedingly rare, and I pissed off a ton of people by asking what they saw in their data, and they didn't have any data. So so it's much better now, which is great.
Exactly. We have all the toys. We have no more excuses.
That's right. That's right.
Mike, have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.